Good morning, everyone. Today, I am here to present the topic of women and politics throughout history. We will be exploring how women have been involved in politics and how their involvement has shaped the political landscape throughout the centuries. I'm sure we will all be able to gain some valuable insight into this powerful and important topic. Let's begin by looking at how women and politics have interacted in the 18th century. During the 18th century, there were multiple alterations in the political environment. Women had no right to be a part of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1706 or the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Abigail Adams famously wrote to her husband John in 1776, exemplifying the unfair laws and social disparities suffered by women in the 18th century. We have the capability to look back and be motivated by her words. Abigail Adams' famous letter to her husband, John Adams, in 1776, cautioned against the unchecked power of men. She implored him to remember the ladies and requested fair recognition of women's capabilities, as well as equitable treatment. In laws, Adams' words still remain pertinent today, prompting us to consider the part of women in contemporary politics. John Adams, a founding father and the second president of the United States, was an outspoken critic of women having a political voice. In a letter to his wife Abigail Adams, he expressed his fear that giving women a political voice would lead to the eventual overturning of the masculine systems and the establishment of a despotism of the petticoat. He even said it would be better to fight than to give up this. This widely accepted view of the time is an important point to consider when looking back at the history of women in politics. Abigail Adams wrote in a letter to her husband John Adams that despite men's declarations of peace and goodwill to all nations, they still maintained considerable sway over wives. She proposed that despite hard laws and maxims, women had the capacity to liberate themselves and to even control their masters without resorting to violence. This highlights the strength and courage of women, both historically and up until the present day, in the field of politics. For centuries, there have been powerful movements around the world, including in the United States, to advance the rights of women. From the abolitionist movement to the civil rights movement, these social movements have been instrumental in hastening changes in our society that have allowed women to play a much larger role in politics and other areas of life. These momentous movements have increased women's access to education, employment, and voting rights, providing the foundation for more gender equality. These social changes are proof that collective activism can create meaningful changes in society and serve as an example of the power of people united by a common cause. As we can observe in the timeline provided, there have been several important movements that focus on women's rights across different time periods. The abolitionist movement, the temperance movement, the suffrage movement, and the civil rights movement are just some of the examples of these movements that have helped shape the world as we know it today. It is important to remember the current progress of each of these movements and to keep striving towards greater equality for women. Today, we are looking at the impact women had in the abolitionist movement. Women of all backgrounds came out of their traditional domestic roles to work against the enslavement of others. Harriet Tubman, a Maryland-born black woman, bravely escaped her own enslavement and became a conductor of the Underground Railroad, leading hundreds to freedom. Later, she joined forces with other leading abolitionists, such as Frederick Douglass and John Brown, to continue her work fighting against slavery. And during the Civil War, she became the first woman to lead an armed expedition, liberating more than 700 slaves in South Carolina. Now, let's take a look at the next slide. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott were two iconic figures spearheading the way toward a brighter future for the citizens of the United States. In 1848, they convened a gathering in Seneca Falls, New York, to tackle women's rights and matters, and to assess the liberty proclaimed in the abolitionist movement. In doing so, they followed the steps of the Founding Fathers, mimicking the Declaration of Sentiments. In the same fashion, Thomas Jefferson had drafted the Declaration of Independence. Their courage and devotion to social reform are deserving of immense admiration. The temperance movement was a significant social movement which sought to promote moderation or even complete abstinence from alcohol. It began in the early 1800s with the emergence of the earliest organizations in New York and Massachusetts. In 1808 and 1813, many churches became actively involved with the movement, and by 1833, it had grown to include over 3,000 local societies in the U.S. Notable figures, such as Carrie A Nation, 1846 and 1911, worked outside of the movement to further its cause. The effects of the temperance movement were far-reaching, both within the U.S. and internationally, and its legacy continues to this day. In 1893, New Zealand became the first country to grant women the right to vote in national elections. Launching the suffrage movement, organized effort in the United States dates back to 1848. In 1869, Wyoming became the first territory and state to grant women the right to vote. This breakthrough contributed to a lasting change in history, providing women with a platform to make their voices heard in the political sphere, advocating for topics of importance to them. In the 19th century, the suffrage and political movements led to the right to vote being gained in certain territories and states before the ratification of the 19th Amendment. In 1920, Wyoming was the first to pass legislation giving women this right in 1869. And until 1918, a few other states followed suit. We can recognize the significance of this development and observe the progress made in the involvement of women in politics. In 1776, New Jersey made a groundbreaking decision by giving voting rights to unmarried women and free people of color who owned a certain amount of property. But in 1807, their voting rights were revoked with a new law. Despite this, New Jersey's actions can be seen as a precursor to the women's suffrage movement, as states such as Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado had already taken steps to grant women the right to vote before the 19th Amendment in 1920 granted it to all American women. Susan B. Anthony was a pioneer in her striving towards women's rights and a better society. She devoted her life to advancing the legal rights of women, specifically the right to vote, and was a founding member of the National Woman Suffrage Association. In addition to suffrage, she was a strong voice in the abolishment of slavery, women's property rights, and equal pay for equal work. To spread her message, she organized rallies, petitions, lectures, and even in a brave act of civil disobedience, she was arrested for voting in the 1872 presidential election. Her actions brought the women's suffrage cause to public attention and highlighted the importance of standing up for what is right and just. Women in the United States were granted the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment in June of 1919, receiving universal ratification in August of 1920. This marked a great step forward for gender equality. The amendment expressly states that no citizen of the United States shall be denied the right to vote because of their gender, and that Congress will have the power to enforce this provision. This amendment allowed women to have a greater say in their lives and was a major accomplishment in the fight for gender equality. Recent years have seen a noteworthy rise in the involvement of women in U.S. politics. In 2008, when Hillary Clinton ran for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination, she experienced some protests from men who argued that a woman should not compete for the presidency. Instead of being intimidated by these protests, Clinton responded with confidence and determination and showed her strength by appealing to the audience. We must also give Kamala Harris due recognition for becoming the first female vice president in 2021. The same year, the U.S. House of Representatives counted 125 female representatives, which corresponds to 29% of the total, and the U.S. Senate had 25 women, accounting for 25% of the Senate. All this evidence illustrates the substantial female presence in U.S. politics. Despite the progress made in the last 100 years, there is still an imbalance of power between men and women in the political realm. Although the record of 12 women serving as state governors simultaneously has been shattered, the percentage of women in politics remains at a staggering 24%. This is a reminder that women need to continue to strive for more representation and more power in politics. Women's political power is an important issue in the United States today. Despite the progress made in the last 100 years, there is still an imbalance of power between men and women in politics. In 2023, a new record of 12 women serving simultaneously as state governors was set, representing 24% of all state governors. Although this is a positive step forward, it does indicate that there is more work to be done to ensure equal representation of women in politics. Nellie Ross and Miriam Ferguson, the first woman governors, serve as inspirations for women to keep striving for more power in politics. Bradwell v. Illinois is a relevant case that shaped the power of women in the United States. In 1873, Myra Bradwell asserted her right to a license to practice law in Illinois. The case ultimately was denied, with a dissenting judge, on the basis that, law being an adversarial, rigorous, and stressful occupation, was not suitable for women. This case set a precedent for future cases of unequal treatment of genders by the government, and serves as an example of the unequal power dynamics between males and females in the 19th century. Women in the 19th century were subjected to unequal treatment in the eyes of the courts. This was exemplified in the Bradwell v. Illinois case in 1873, in which Myra Bradwell asserted her right to a license to practice law in Illinois by virtue of her status as a United States citizen, only to have the judges of the Illinois Supreme Court deny her application. The court reasoned that since law is a stressful and adversarial occupation, it was not suitable for women. This case set a precedent for gender inequality in the legal system and shows the limits of women's power in the 19th century. Myra Bradwell's petition to be admitted to the bar was denied by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1873 in the case of Bradwell v. Illinois. Myra had argued that her right to practice law was protected by the 14th Amendment, but the court disagreed. Justice Bradley's reasoning for this decision was centered around the importance of maintaining the traditional, respective spheres of man and woman, with women expected to abide by the law of the Creator in regards to her duties as motherhood and wife. This ruling reflects the long-standing gender inequality seen throughout the U.S. legal system, and this remains evident in many aspects of our society even today. For decades, women have been a major part of higher education, and the enrollment rates are only increasing. A study in spring 2023 showed that women make up 58% of college students. Gaining economic and political power through higher education remains a powerful tool for women. Although it is not the only choice available, we need to carry on offering our support to women as they seek to pursue their educational dreams, as it can be a crucial stepping stone in their journey to gaining success in society. In 2019, approximately 45% of all full-time faculty members in the United States were women, an increase from the 31% reported several years prior. This steady progress in the numbers of women in academia is encouraging as we work towards gender equality in education. Women now account for 33% of college and university presidencies, with 43% of leaders in community colleges being women. Though progress is being made, there is still a gap in the representation of gender diversity in higher education leadership, particularly in doctoral institutions, with only 29% of presidencies held by women. Therefore, there is still a need to push for greater gender diversity in higher education leadership. For the past half-century, we have seen dramatic progress in acknowledging the aptitude and command aptitude of women in the business realm. In 2023, 10.6% of the Fortune 500 companies were run by women, comprising of 53 out of 500 businesses, a remarkable accomplishment for sex uniformity in the work environment. The Washington Post Co. was the initial business to cross the Fortune 500 boundary, with its CEO, Katharine Graham. As far back as 1972, we have made immense progress from that point forward, and we must keep carrying on for equity and representation in the workplace. The gap between men and women in politics is still too wide, but in the world of wealth, there is a different story. Data from Forbes shows that in 2023, 337 female billionaires accounted for more than 15% of the total. In the U.S., more than 13% of billionaires in 2022 were female, out of a total of 735 billionaires. This number has risen since 2020, indicating that although a gap still exists in politics, women's financial power is growing. As we have seen, single-mother households make up a significant portion of families in the U.S. These single-parent households are overwhelmingly headed by mothers, leading to higher poverty rates for single mothers than any other household type. This is a concerning trend and highlights the challenges faced by families living in single-parent households. The unique challenges faced by women in the arena of politics are numerous. Understanding these challenges and their implications is integral to ensuring that women have equal access and opportunities in the political arena. I hope that this presentation has given you some insight into the unique challenges faced by women in the arena of politics. Thank you for your attention.